Hello, Imperfect Leaders. I am so excited. My new book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership in After Action, is now available. You can order it by going to Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I've seen it online in lots of bookstores. And if you like it, would you please leave a positive review? Thank you so much for your support. When I was a superintendent, I was called to a meeting with an economics professor. What they wanted to discuss with me was using the results of standardized tests to evaluate the effectiveness of a teacher. And I bristled at the idea of looking at the score of an external test to determine whether or not a teacher was effective. Now, when they asked if I would consider looking at growth data, meaning how much growth a child made over a 10-month period to determine whether or not a teacher was being effective, I became a lot less hostile. I do think there's value in that. For one thing, I can remember using that type of data analysis when determining whether or not children in a particular class were actually regressing over the first months of school and how we needed to intervene quickly to provide support. However, I struggle with the idea that rewarding one teacher for a child's growth is appropriate in some way. Rewarding the school? Yes, I can get behind that. Think about it. You've got an excellent reading teacher. They are reading recovery trained and equipped to save a child's life. However, the child comes to school because every morning he gets to eat breakfast with the custodian, someone who has taken an interest in that child's life. Or she gets to stay after school and participate in the swim club the PE teacher hosts every Tuesday and Thursday at the local pool. Or they get to process their traumas with the school counselor, and they get to tend to the school's gecko in the science teacher's classroom. Schools are a mosaic. They are many small pieces coming together to make something beautiful. My guest today is a researcher who helps schools understand what their data is telling them. And he talks about avoiding the mistake of making an inference that the data doesn't support. And he emphasizes the importance of school culture. I've put a link to 4 pieces of advice titled, Don't Let Statistics Become Damn Lies. Dr. Brian Gill is my guest. It's a different look at leadership this week. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Brian Gill is my guest. Brian is a senior fellow on K-12 education policy at Mathematica and director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Educational Laboratory for the U.S. Department of Education. And it is perfect that I'm talking to a mathematician on Pi Day. So how about that? Brian, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. Great.
I typically don't tell the date so that one could listen to this podcast again and not say like, oh, that's old. But Pi Day of all days. So there you go. It is really wonderful to meet you. And I have been hearing from superintendents and school leaders since the beginning of this podcast. And one area that they want to hear more about is something that you wrote about in a recent article. And that's that superintendents are just swimming in data. And that they, at times, they make like really big decisions based on how they're interpreting their data. And you noted in that issue, and you took a step further and actually put forth a framework for leaders to consider when they're thinking about student learning. Would you talk just a little bit about what you mean by the 3 complementary elements: outcomes, impacts, and processes?
Yeah, sure, Peter. So that 3-part framework really was motivated by the recognition that, everybody wants to be data-driven, but in practice, a lot of us are data drowning, right? And so we need a clear understanding of what the data are telling us and what they're not telling us. The 3-part framework is based on the recognition that superintendents, other district staff, school leaders, they need to know how the students are doing. That's the outcomes. They need to know how their schools are contributing to how the students are doing, to student growth. That's the impacts part. And they need to know what is happening inside the schools. That's the processes. Now, most districts probably have some measures of each of these things, but they might not have a clear sense of how the different kinds of measures are useful for different sorts of decisions. So outcome measures would obviously include academic proficiency, but potentially also all sorts of other measures of student outcomes, whether those are social, emotional, graduation, post-secondary success. Those are, of course, essential for determining which student groups, which schools might need more attention. But by themselves, they don't tell a district leader whether any particular low-performing subgroup of students or a low-performing school is low-performing because the school isn't serving them well, or because of factors that are outside the school's control, maybe external disadvantages of the kids that school happens to serve. And that's where the impact measures come in. That's why we do try to come up with measures of student growth or value added. Those are a couple of the types of impact measures. We've developed another group of them that we call promotion power, where we're looking at schools' impacts on things that aren't test scores, like graduation and post-secondary results. In any case, the general idea of the impact measures is to use statistical methods to try to identify the school's contribution to the outcomes and distinguish that from things that are outside the school's control, so that can help a superintendent assess whether the school itself needs some attention to improve instruction, to serve its students better. So, and then finally, that turns to the third category. You need good measures of processes. What's actually happening inside the school? Those might be produced by climate surveys of staff and students, walkthroughs, classroom observations. That's the sort of thing that a district leader is going to need to take the next step, even once you've identified that a school, say, is not serving its students as well as it should. If you want to figure out why or where it needs to do something better, you need to know something about what's happening inside the school. And so the general point, again, is that distinguishing these categories of measures is really important for understanding which different judgments and decisions they're useful for. So, this can go, if you don't have a clear sense of which decisions they're useful for, you might make a mistake about the kind of interventions you want to put in schools. If, for example, if you've got a school with low proficiency rate, low student outcome measures, if that school happens to be serving an especially disadvantaged group and it's producing large growth in those students, producing substantial positive impacts, so that the kids are, even if they don't look like they're high performing, they're doing better than they would elsewhere in a different school. That suggests that what you want to help those kids in that school would be very different than the kind of intervention that might be needed in a school where maybe the proficiency rates are actually a little bit higher, but the growth is very low. The kids are not doing as well as they ought to be, as they would be somewhere else.
Sometimes we referred to those schools when I was a superintendent as the lucky schools, right? Kids who may already be coming in with many of the skills and abilities and experiences needed to do well in a traditional or just any kind of school model, and how important it was for children who have historically underperformed because of either systems or experiences, that we had to be really thoughtful about the systems we were putting in place in order to help them. I was really curious about something that you said earlier about social emotional, because using statistical analysis not only to see what tools, approaches, and strategies have a positive effect on child's learning, that makes a lot of sense. For instance, it has been said that if a child enrolls and passes an AP course, that it is more likely that they'll complete college, and if they've done 2 AP courses, even more likely. And then after that, there's no real change in their ability to finish or not. But you were starting to talk about statistical tools to show the likelihood a graduate will graduate school with the necessary levels of social emotional intelligence to be successful. And I was really curious about that. Would you tell us about that?
So I think there's a couple of distinct points here that are important to talk about. Both of them are related, though, to making sure we have broad enough measures to really understand school performance. So the first point is related to the kinds of outcomes we measure. We've all been measuring reading and math proficiency for a long time. Social emotional learning is a much more recent thing to measure. But I view it as encouraging that we're broadening the outcomes that are being measured, because the fact is, in schools, we're not just trying to make the kids proficient in reading and math. We're trying to prepare them for successful adulthood. My personal particular aspect of that I'm interested in is successful citizenship, which after all is the original historical purpose of public education, right? So there are lots of competencies, lots of skills, lots of knowledge that aren't captured by reading and math proficiency assessments, right? Social emotional learning, there's lots of good evidence that there are various kinds of social emotional skills that are related to success in adulthood. So it makes sense to be looking at measures of social emotional skills alongside the traditional academic measures. It makes sense also to be looking at academic measures, in subjects outside of reading and math. It makes sense in thinking about what sort of things would we want kids to know to be prepared to be effective citizens in our democracy. So I think, it's just useful to keep in mind that sometimes we put too much effort into the things that we happen to have measures of now, right? And it's easy to forget the fact that there are other things that maybe we could measure, and some places are measuring, that deserve some attention too, and shouldn't be forgotten just because we haven't been measuring them historically.
I wonder, can I unpack that a little bit? Because I could imagine we both, when we think about it, having a shared image of what great schools look like or what graduates should have. Obviously, we have some academic components that we probably agree to. I would imagine we would both agree that empathy and compassion, being able to demonstrate those two qualities or characteristics, collaboration or high levels of being able to work together as a team, the interpersonal relationships and developing those. I'm curious, what are some ways that you measure that, aside from looking at what one might just sort of quickly go to in terms of suspension rates and absenteeism and those types of things that might suggest that a child is struggling at school?
Yeah. So, I think absenteeism is a really nice one to use as a proxy particularly for engagement, right? And engagement is probably going to be related to a lot of those other skills. So that's a good place to start because everybody's got measures of it, right? And it's known to be predictive of dropout and various other kinds of bad outcomes for kids. I don't want to point to any particular scales, but I think that there are various kinds of surveys that have been done related to social emotional skills and that can try to assess some of those things. Some of these things are definitely hard to measure well, and it's also, one of the messages that I like to keep in mind throughout is that there's only so much you can get out of measurement, right? And sometimes it can point you in wrong directions, particularly if there are risks in attaching stakes to a measure, right? So for things like social emotional surveys, in most instances, I think it would be a bad idea to make them high stakes for a school or an educator, right? Because it's too easy to undermine the measures. And I think most of the good survey firms and psychometric firms will give some pretty clear indications of the limits of what you should, of the conclusions you can draw from those. But there are definitely ways to take advantage of these things. I can give you a couple of examples that might be of interest. We worked through the Mid-Atlantic Regional Lab a couple of years ago. We worked with the District of Columbia Public Schools on measuring social emotional learning, and in particular because they set as a district-wide objective to make sure all their students were loved, challenged, and prepared. And they were using one of the well-known surveys in social emotional learning to check this out, and brought us in to try to figure out how to create indices of each of those three elements and put them together. And they incorporated that into one of their district-wide public aims, which was kind of cool.
In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension called the leader's learning work. And that's really just speaks to the mind of the organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term, systems design and systems thinking. And so as I read your article, it was sort of just screaming to me about the kinds of systems that need to exist in a building, in a district, and evaluating whether or not they're working. And one that came to mind was a stock flow map. In order to increase achievement, there are strategies that will make it more likely that your stock, which in this case is like percentage of life-ready graduates, will increase. But in order to increase the stock, a leader has to have some prerequisites that they're considering. So one example is, and I think you provide this, is culture, right? Specifically, you speak to the power of survey data. And I wonder if you would describe what you mean by this and how you have seen survey data to be used to make meaningful shifts in a school district's or a school's culture.
Yeah. So, for the last decade or so, various schools and districts across the country have started using surveys of school climate. Sometimes, usually they're given to both staff and to students, occasionally to parents too. Typically much harder to get a good response rate for parents.
Yes, although if you're a school receiving Title I funds, you have an obligation to go get that parent data.
Yep. You just have to hope that it's not a very unusual group of parents who happen to be the ones who respond. I've yet to see anybody sort of solve the problem of figuring out how to get a truly representative sample of parent viewpoints, because typically response rates are very low, and the folks who respond in some instances are the ones who are likely to be pretty happy or at the other extreme.
Exactly.
But for students and staff, many places have figured out how to get very good responses. And frankly, they're the ones in the school every day, right? So they probably have better information in most instances than the parents do anyway. I would say, if I were a superintendent, one of the first things I'd want to know about any school is how the teachers think you're operating, right? And one of the second things I'd want to know is how do the students experience it?
I just want to pause right there because I think those are two really important questions, and they're different from some survey questions that we have encountered in other experiences, because you're not asking the superintendent, what do you like about me, or what do you think I need to be doing different? You're asking for specific examples about the operations, which will yield some really good insights about what's working and what could be better, or what's going well and how, looking for ways to get more of it. And then you speak to the experiences of children. And I think sometimes we forget that that's exactly what we're all about, is what do we want for children, and what are their experiences, and how can we improve them so that, I would imagine they go hand in hand in terms of like a causal relationship. When those experiences are enriching, then children come to school because they feel valued and they feel energized and they are challenged and their curiosities are championed. And so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just think that those are two really important ones that shouldn't be seen as a throwaway. Those are very different from some questions that we sometimes ask our faculties and sometimes what we ask our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done some interesting work looking at relationships between the way students perceive the environment and the way teachers perceive the environment. There are some systematic differences at times that are things you might expect. The students tend to think they're better off in terms of like social emotional skills and grit than the teachers think they are. The teachers tend to think that the instruction is more rigorous than the students perceive it as. So there's some, there's some systematic differences there. But even that said, if you look across schools, you definitely see correlations. That is, you don't see schools where the teachers think it's fabulous and the students hate it, or vice versa. If the school is generally doing well, you're typically going to see it in both sets of surveys.
Brian, I ask a question, and I'd like to ask you the same one that I ask every guest. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
I like it. I think it suggests how hard it is to lead schools and school districts, and that there has to be a willingness to learn, I think, from one's own experience, from others' experiences, from existing research. I don't think, given the complexities of leading schools and leading districts, I think it would be very hard to even specify what a perfect leader would be, because there are so many different dimensions of the work. To the extent that it reflects a kind of an aspiration to keep learning and doing better, I think that's great.
And we'll be right back. An Imperfect Leader is brought to you by EdConnective, whose mission is to ensure student success through transformative teacher training. EdConnective helps teachers move from awareness about strategies and frameworks to successful and consistent implementation. Their friendly coaches celebrate classroom success with teachers, and with concrete classroom data, support teachers in their growth, one step at a time. I've been thinking about this a lot. During the pandemic, student teachers didn't get a chance to do their student teaching with children. They just started teaching in classrooms. And they need help. Across the nation, states are adopting higher expectations to make up for learning loss. That's where EdConnective fits in. Their vision is that every student deserves a great teacher, and every teacher deserves a great coach. Find out more by contacting them at edconnective.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. Dr. Brian Gill is my guest, and Brian is a senior fellow on K-12 education policy at Mathematica and director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Educational Laboratory for the U.S. Department of Education. And you described it as the lab earlier, and I'm like, I should start calling it the lab instead of laboratory. That's a lot. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, or one that they were a part of, and we discuss it. So, Brian, what happened?
So one of the most sort of frustrating and disappointing examples I've seen of a case where a district essentially drowned itself in data. This was probably a decade or so ago, when this district, like so many districts and states all over the country, was putting a lot of effort into trying to improve its measures of teacher evaluation, teacher performance measures. And in particular, it implemented value-added statistical models to try to assess teachers' contributions to student outcomes. To refer back to the framework we started with at the beginning, this would be an impact measure, in essence, which in principle can be a good and useful thing if it's done carefully. But here was the problem. The district thought that it would dig deep into the data and give teachers lots of very finely grained information on the value added they had, not only on average, but for every particular student subgroup they could think of, by race, ethnicity, by gender, by English learner status, by special education status, and sometimes combinations of these, such that a value-added report for an individual teacher might have been 15 pages long. Moreover, and it would mean that in many instances, they're looking at very small numbers of kids in these subgroups. And they were using sort of a conventional statistical approach of trying to flag instances where a teacher's result was significantly distinguishable from, say, average performance. It was statistically significant in a positive or negative direction. Now, those of you who are familiar with this terminology will know that usually that's done with a 95% confidence interval. P equals 0.05. We don't need to get into the details of that, but the general point is that it implies, with a 95% confidence interval, that that in at least 1 out of 20 cases, when you run these significance tests, you will find one that comes out as statistically significant just by chance. That's actually not meaningful, even though it is nominally statistically significant.
And yet they're making decisions on a teacher's employment, tenure,
Yes.
potentially in some states where they have bonuses tied to performance, those types of things. I imagine that could be really problematic.
Yes, absolutely. So it's it's a failure to recognize the limitations of statistics, a failure to see how you can, when you produce an enormous amount of data, you're going to produce a lot of false positives, right? And so this is a problem even among researchers. There are, in fact, statistical approaches that can make the right adjustments so you're producing good information without claiming to provide more information than you really can. But it's an example of the kind of thing that happens all too often. And over time, it undermines the credibility of these systems, right? It's not just that it gets the wrong answer. It's that educators can see that it's getting the wrong answer.
Let me ask you a question just to back up for those who may not be completely familiar with value added or growth. Would you mind just taking a step and helping? I always think about this from the perspective of my mother's listening to this and is going to call me and say, what was value added? In the most Long Island accent. So would you talk just a little bit about what you mean by that? And then I'd like to recap a little bit and ask you some follow-up questions.
Yeah. So conceptually, I think the idea is to try to get at impact, and it could be an impact of a teacher if it's a measure for an individual teacher, or it could be an impact of a school if it's a school's value added. But it goes to that distinction I made at the beginning that you wouldn't want to think, if you just looked at student outcomes, proficiency rates, whatever your student outcomes are, social emotional learning. If you just looked at the outcomes at the end of the year for a teacher or a school, you're not going to be able to tell, even, those outcomes might be high or low, good or bad, but unless you know where those kids were coming from, you have no way of knowing, how much the teacher or school contributed to that measure. So that conceptually is what a value-added measure is supposed to do. Statistically, it's a pretty complex thing. It's worth remembering that it's typically looking at only one outcome measure. So it's an impact on that outcome. And that's why, I would like to see more impact measures on some of the other outcomes too, whether they're social emotional learning, whether they're graduation, post-secondary results. And there's some good research suggesting that there may be some relationship between those, but some teachers, some schools might be particularly good at one and not so good at the other.
I think you're really talking about something that I have not been a part of as a superintendent, and I only retired about a year ago, and that is that all the conversation about value added was about academics, about reading, about math. Yeah. And boy, I think I might have had a very different impression of, or at least been more open-minded to using growth or value added in my district if it were more about the whole child than just one discrete area of growth. And then I really appreciated how you talked about the fact that you could look at it from a teacher and looking at it from a school, because I think it's the school is where I could come around and say I support this in terms of value added, because it could be the PE teacher that gets the kid to school because she's got a swim team after school or a swim club, or it could be the school counselor who has a friendship group at lunchtime and this child has moved 17 times and lives with an aunt 3 days a week and a grandmother the other 4 days a week. And it's the school that played that role in allowing the teacher to have an impact on that child's reading growth.
Yeah, and that's particularly important if you're thinking about longer term outcomes that aren't just this year's test scores. So we worked with a couple of states, Louisiana and, well, DC, not actually a state, but they have a state education agency, to develop measures of high school impacts on things like graduation, enrollment in college, persistence in college. In Louisiana, we even had workforce data. We could look at earnings at age 26, 8 years after graduation.
So let me ask you a quick question, though. So I'm going to truncate this a little bit because our conversation has been so wonderful, and I typically go through 5 questions. They typically take a little bit longer, but there are just, I think, 3 that are I think, really important to this conversation. So to recap, you have a school district that you're familiar with. They want to look at the value of instruction, and so they tie it to evaluation of their teachers, and they are really interested to see how children are doing from lots of groups, and sometimes that's referred to through federal language subgroups, which
Right.
seems like a challenging word for any of us to say, but they are the groups of children as a way to distinguish one group of children from another. However, they went and did it to such an extreme that they were doing it from any distinguishable difference between groups of kids, racially, ethnically, language, special education, anything like that. And that was, from your perspective, fairly challenging for them to actually pull any meaningful information about the performance of a teacher. And so what got overlooked from your perspective? What got overlooked?
Yeah. So there is an interesting paradox, right? It's, I mean, I'm a researcher, I'm a data guy, I love data. I tend to think more data is better. But more data also poses risks because it does lead to a greater likelihood of that you'll see something that is a fluke. There's an analogy in medical testing, right? If you have a chronic illness and you have to get lots of medical tests done all the time, you learn fairly quickly that sometimes they're going to find things, right? And often those things will turn out to be nothing. The thing you want to avoid is going on a fishing expedition where you just are, trying to find a story that makes sense of all this data when, as humans, we have we like to tell stories. We like to fit something to a narrative. And in fact, when you're looking at lots of different data points, you just always have to keep in mind that there are statistical flukes for which there is no narrative. It was just a fluke.
So what got overlooked from your perspective is that they took this information, this data, and forced a narrative that potentially, or what got overlooked was the fact that the data may not be telling them the story that they believe to be true. Does that sound?
Yes. Yes.
What could they have done differently?
So in that instance, I don't want to tell people they shouldn't look at subgroup data, right? I mean, we're interested in subgroup data because we want to promote equity. We want to promote equitable outcomes. That's their intent.
Yes, and the opposite of that is a superintendent can walk to their Kiwanis club and their Rotaries and say, our kids read at a 4th grade level, when they're in 3rd grade, and aren't we fantastic? But when you disaggregate that data, they can quickly find that actually our children who participate in federal lunch program are reading below a 3rd grade level. And I'm not highlighting or spotlighting or blaming, but rather recognizing that there are, to your point of the 3 different constructs, there are things that we need to change and shift at certain schools for certain children.
Yes.
In the end, this podcast it's designed to help aspiring and early in their career and established leaders learn from the experiences of other leaders. And so with that in mind, what advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
I would say learn how to use your data to be data-driven without drowning in data. Now, let's be more specific about that. Make sure that you've got a framework in which you can make sense of what your measures are telling you and what they are not telling you. I'd recommend checking out the article because I think the framework I proposed is a pretty good one for classifying measures in ways that that clarify what they're useful for and what they're not useful for, and how they're complementary to each other. And then finally, the last thing I would say, I guess, is that we also need to recognize that there's only so far data can take us, right? There are some things about education that are inevitably going to be so hard to measure that we can't put a data point on them. And so keep in mind that data can be very powerful, but they're not going to be sufficient on their own to help you manage your schools.
I hope the Association of Statisticians is not going to kick you out for saying that. But, yeah.
I don't think so.
My guest again was Dr. Brian Gill. And Brian, schools really they're swimming in data, and they have access to data collected at the state level and the federal level. They've got access to district data, school-based data, they have grade level data, they have classroom data. Teachers and principals, they're deeply committed to trying to use that information to make the very best decisions for children. And just having had this conversation with you has so much more clearly, created a clearer pathway for leaders as they decide what to pay attention to. I love the fact that you're looking at social emotional as this new step in data collection and ways to help communities really make a decision about whether or not they are being true to the promise that they make to their community in terms of graduates who will be great citizens, and helping them to avoid making those imprecise plans because they've been focusing on their own data. Thank you so much for spending time with me.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.